Hi, I'm Maddie. I have chosen to interview my grandfather, John Bradbury. Before we get into more of the detailed questions, he's going to tell us a little bit about himself and his life.
Well, hello Madison and guests. I'm glad to be here. My name is John Lewis Bradbury. I'm retired and I'm 72 years old, which makes me a dinosaur. I was married for 11 years, divorced and married 38 years. I have 4 girls from my first marriage. All of them are married, and what's really special is they all still speak to me and my current wife, and they like to go on trips with us. In fact, I have a trip with 2 of my daughters to England in the near future and France. In January, we're going to have a family reunion in Kauai, Hawaii. I have 10 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren.
Wow, you're getting old.
Yes, and I hope to get older. I have lots of plans still. On the Bradbury side, I was the 5th generation to be born in San Francisco. My birth date is December 11th, 1945. I was at the front of the baby boomers. I should have been born in Hawaii territory. During World War II, my dad was a merchant marine. My mother worked for the Navy on the island of Oahu. My Holbert grandparents also worked for the military on the island, and he was a World War I veteran. My parents were married in Honolulu, and later when she became pregnant, they sent her home because the war was still on. My 7th great-grandfather, Thomas Bradbury, who was born at one of the locations that we're going to go to in England, came to what is now known as Maine in 1634. He came here as a land agent for his uncle. He married Mary Perkins, who was convicted as a witch at the Salem witch trials. On her execution day, she and another person were passed over for some unknown reason. Probably money switched hands. 7 others were not so lucky. Relatives fought on both sides of the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. In fact, I believe one of my relatives was at the Battle of Concord in Lexington when the shots that were fired that were heard around the world. I knew my grandparents and great-grandmother, Mays May. Here's a photograph of her taken about 1890 before she got married. Her father was a 49er and came to California by sea. Relatives on both sides of my extended family came to California by sea, covered wagon, or after 1869 by the Transcontinental Railroad. Have another picture I'd like to show Madison because I know she's interested in fashion. This is a picture of my great-great-grandmother who came by covered wagon. This is taken about 1930, and you can see her dress, and I'm going to move closer toward the camera. That's a typical 1850, 1860 dress. Next to her is her daughter. You can see how fashion's changed, and then you can see my grandmother and how fashions have changed again. And then those 2 guys on either side are my father and uncle. Both my father and uncle were sea captains. And then I had great-grandmother Cora Dotson, who came from Texas, and she used to talk about Comanche raids that occurred when she was young. The 3 most important or influential people in my life were my grandmother Holbert, my mother, and my stepfather John Tucker.
Thank you. How, even though you weren't born yet, do you believe the U.S., following the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima August 6 and Nagasaki 3 days later, changed America?
You're right, I was not born for the dropping of the bombs, but I do remember the after effects. I do remember the fear or concern over a nuclear war with the Soviets and the feeling that nuclear war was survivable. There were duck and cover drills at school, and buildings were marked with shelter signs. I remember standing at attention each school morning for the raising of the flag. I remember how schools changed after the Soviets beat us into space. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis and how we almost bought a home in the Caneo Valley that had a bomb shelter.
That sounds terrifying.
Yes, it was.
What were you doing, and what were your thoughts the day JFK was assassinated? Many say hope in America died that day. Do you agree or disagree with this statement, and how do you believe America was changed?
I don't believe hope died that day. There's always hope. But I was a senior at Canoga Park High School. I was in my advanced world history class. It must have been around 11 o'clock. There were mixed emotions in the class. The teacher, Mr. Freed, had tears in his eyes. He was a Korean War veteran. I thought it was a terrible event, but it took years for me to see how it changed the course of American history. Because of his death, the Great Society, voters, and civil rights bills were passed. It is unknown if President Kennedy would have fallen into the Vietnam trap as LBJ did. President Kennedy's death, to me, was similar to Lincoln being shot and not being there to stop the evil sides of Reconstruction, the punishment of the South, and the disenfranchisement of blacks. President Kennedy's death was followed by the assassination of his brother, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. One can only wonder what changes would have occurred if they had lived.
Do you believe America had lost trust in the government by the end of the Vietnam War? If so, has this trust ever been won back?
Good question. The Vietnam War was a catalyst. It seemed to go on and on. With the war on TV every night, it was never far from our thoughts. It was a war that the mission or purpose became blurred. A lot of soldiers dying far away. It was worse than Korea and going nowhere. The 60s were a time of protest and changes, and the war just added to the discontent. I think there has always been distrust of the equality of our government. The 60s just made it worse. The trust continues to go back and forth as it must. Today, people still wonder if Washington has our best interests at heart.
How did the world's perception change of America on July 20th, 1969, when we put the first man on the moon?
I remember all of the launchings of the Apollo program. You sit and watch TV. When we reached the moon, it helped restore the U.S. as the world leader in space and technology. And one thing that I think of in hindsight now is the space program led to the development of computers and the advancements of computers, which led to the computer revolution and cell phones and all of that. I do know it made the Soviets take a secondary position, and they were never able to accomplish the same goals that we had. The USA took a real hit when the Soviets beat us into space with Sputnik and sending the first man into orbit. Schools and educations changed in 1957 to meet the challenge. The government under President Kennedy focused the goal to put a man on the moon. Vast, and I mean lots of money and resources were expended to reach that goal. Unfortunately, once the goal was reached, it was not expanded. The will to spend money on the space program was vastly reduced.
That's not good.
Yeah. And we're trying to get back there now.
How did the world look at the U.S. following Nixon's resignation on August 8th, 1974, in response to the Watergate scandal?
I never gave it much of a thought on how the rest of the world looked at us. Probably if it did, it would just have looked like business as usual for most countries. They were probably more shocked when it brought the president down. It was a shocker in this country, though. Nixon, the man who ended our part in the Vietnam conflict and opened up our relationship with China, was caught with his hand in the cookie jar. It was proof that our government was corrupt at times. Scandals were everywhere. Vice President Agnew had been forced to resign. Speaker of the House Ford became vice president and then president when Nixon resigned. It led to good guy Governor Carter of Georgia becoming the next president. It drove the Republican Party out of any power for at least 6 years. It did confirm, however, that there was a viable system for replacing the president.
That's a lot of change all at once.
It
Next
was.
question. How do you believe the nation changed on November 9th, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, effectively ending the Cold War?
Well, I think that you have a good idea how some of the changes. You've been to the Ronald Reagan Museum. You've seen the chunk of the Berlin Wall, and you've read the stories that were written. I know I watched it on TV. The Cold War was supposed to have ended. The evil empire was collapsing. The Iron Curtain that Churchill had foretold was lifted in Eastern Europe. Germany was reunited. Poland, the country that led to World War II, was again free to govern themselves. We had spent the Soviets into collapse. Our country changed too. Military spending and the nuclear stockpile were reduced. Small, isolated terrorist-type wars seemed to grow in areas where there were power vacuums. Spending in this country turned more towards domestic issues for a while. I think the whole process has been a reminder that there will always be issues and problems in the world and what we are willing to do about them.
We're almost done. Next question. What do you remember about September 11th, 2001, when the country experienced a terrorist attack on both the World Trade Center and the Pentagon? And how do you believe America was changed by this tragic event?
I watched that on TV too, as most of us did. The issues raised in question 10 have come home to haunt us. A group of well-financed terrorists, financed by our friends the Saudis, show that if they're willing to die for their cause, they can be successful. They brought their religious wars to America. It did not surprise me. Being in law enforcement, I had classes in terrorism early on. In the 1984 Olympics, we were concerned about terrorist attacks. And I have a photo that shows you, and not you, but your mother and your aunt and Josanna and myself at one of the command posts for the LAPD in West Los Angeles during the Olympics.
The command post was named Fort Bradbury.
Yes.
Pretty cool.
The thing that did surprise me about the attack was the complete failure of our vast intelligence group to detect the actual attack. As a result of the attack, the government that we really don't trust has a lot more control over our lives and privacy. Vast amounts of money and resources have been spent and new layers of government created to protect us. Our lives have become more complicated, yet we are shocked when we learn how intrusive the government has become in the communications area. Yet anyone that reads spy novels would have known years ago that the government has been monitoring all of our communications for years.
Okay. Final question. This one is kind of more personal question. Many people say that every American citizen has a dream, whether it be to accumulate wealth or find happiness or create a better life for your children. What do you believe your dream was, and do you believe you have achieved it where you are now?
Okay. I had several dreams that motivated me. I wanted a good education, to get a good job. I wanted a family and home. I think one of the most important things that focused my life or gave me direction was I've always thought about any action I take, would I like my mother to read about it in the newspaper. It's really given me directions on how and ways to do things. I thought I would have it made if I made $10,000 a year. Thanks to my parents, grandmother Holbert, my stepfather John Tucker, my wife Sandy, and my wife Josanne, these modest goals that I had have been exceeded. I think often now about history and why things are the way they are. Seems to me your life is altered in a second if you make the wrong turn and are unlucky. And I think the one thing I want to close with, I'm wishing you all the luck, skills, and abilities to discern the right turns in your life.
Thank you for letting me interview you, Grandpa. That's the end. Thanks for watching.
Goodbye now.